It's safe to say that some horror movies, at least in the past, have not been known for their amazing portrayal of female characters. Many would say that this is simply the nature of the horror genre. So-called scream queens are a staple of horror films, and even part of their appeal. One horror subgenre that takes a different view of female characters is folk horror. In fact, in a recent documentary about the history of folk horror in film, the genre was touted as having strong feminist themes since the film genre's inception in the 1970s. While it is tempting to take this assertion as fact without question, I think it's not entirely true, and at very least worth investigating. Certainly, folk horror often seems to concern women and femininity, but whether folk horror promotes female empowerment, emancipation, or feminism is another question entirely. When we take a closer look, we see that femininity in folk horror, although a common theme, is a complex and nuanced subject. There are as many different interpretations of this theme as there are films that involve it. It's a subject that deserves discussion, if only to highlight how well many folk horror films handle female characters. Today, let's take a tour through folk horror and how women are portrayed in this genre. Overview. There is no doubt that since the 1970s, strong, self-directed women have been a driving force of many of the narratives in folk horror films. Films such as The Blood on Satan's Claw and The Wicker Man include such female characters. Characters who know what they want and are willing to do anything to get it. Whether these are good role models is another question. In addition to strong, self-directed female characters, folk horror has always included complex female characters as well. Characters such as Nora in Robin Redbreast, who struggles with a sinister village conspiring against her, or Sarah in Witchfinder General, who must contend with the terrifying Witchfinder, Matthew Hopkins. More recently, we have seen several folk horror films where the plot concerns complex and conflicted female protagonists and characters. Midsummer and The Witch are such examples, which grapple with new and different female-centered themes than previous folk horror films. I think it's fair to say that all of these narratives pass the Bechdel test. Women's roles in these films is not a supporting one. They are not merely there as a love interest for a male character. Their autonomy moves the plot forward. Generally, if romance does occur in folk horror, it is an act of seduction or manipulation, not as an idealized romance. Women in these films are often part of a power struggle between genders or between societal roles. On this note, it's actually surprising how much violence towards men by women there is in folk horror films. In folk horror, women poison, manipulate, or murder male characters. Often they are the aggressors. Films like Antichrist, The Blood on Satan's Claw, The Witch, and Hagazusa are examples, among others. The complexity of female emancipation in folk horror. In folk horror, women's road to self-empowerment or independence is not depicted as an easy process. In the folk horror genre, female empowerment is difficult and messy. Often, to attain an empowered, self-directed position, women are forced to accept or do things they would rather not do, give up parts of themselves they would rather not give up. A good example, although a bit obvious, is that in The Witch, before the main character Thomasin joins a witch's coven, she must write her name in the devil's book.
What will you from me?
Dost thou see a book before thee?
I cannot write my name.
I will guide thy hand.
An action which symbolizes giving up one's soul to the devil. In order to achieve freedom, independence, and power, she literally has to give up her soul. Let's take a look at some more complex examples of how women are forced to sacrifice to achieve independence in folk horror films. In the film Midsummer, we see a woman struggling with a codependent relationship with her boyfriend. As the audience, we want her to be able to leave that relationship and find independence, or at very least proper emotional support. The process this woman must undergo is difficult and painful. Let's take a closer look. The main character in the film, Danny, is in a complex situation. Recently, her entire family was murdered by her mentally ill sister. She seems to be alone in the world apart from her boyfriend Christian. However, Danny is entangled in a toxic relationship with Christian. We see at the start of the film that Christian wants to end the relationship, but is indecisive. He is keeping the relationship going, even though he doesn't really want to be a part of it anymore. He is afraid that if he breaks up with Danny, he will regret it later, and he doesn't give much thought to Danny's emotions on this matter. Throughout several points in the film, Christian is dishonest with Danny. He either doesn't tell her the truth or doesn't tell her the whole truth. In short, he treats her badly. Danny has anxiety about losing her relationship. She has a strong fear of abandonment and has difficulty asserting herself in her relationship. She has a habit of profusely apologizing to Christian even when she has done nothing wrong.
Well, then I'm sorry. I just got confused. I'm sorry.
Please, I overreacted. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I am sorry.
That's fine.
I'm sorry about last night.
She also takes responsibility for Christian's own bad behavior.
Kristen forgot anyway, so this is amazing. Thank you.
Oh.
No. I forgot to remind him, and it's not his fault. Never mind. It's okay.
Danny accompanies Christian and his friends on a trip to a remote Swedish village where a religious festival is being held. Once they are at the village, Danny and the other visitors' situation deteriorates as they realize the sinister intentions of the villagers. Danny must contend with both her toxic relationship, her emotions, and a dangerous cult in whose midst she finds herself. The crux of Midsummer is about a woman leaving a bad relationship, but this process is not straightforward. Danny slowly finds herself being indoctrinated into the pagan cult, but her relationship with this cult is just as manipulative and unhealthy as her relationship with Christian. While people in the cult do sympathize with Danny and are welcoming and accepting of her, they are also very manipulative. They intentionally destroy her relationship with Christian, severing her very last tie to the outside world, and at the same time put her in a position where she is an accomplice to murder. By the end of the film, Danny is trapped. She has no one left outside the cult. Through her journey of leaving a toxic relationship, Danny has gone from one bad situation to another. She isn't truly emancipated or empowered despite her change in circumstances. The process of leaving her toxic relationship was difficult and ultimately may have left her in a worse situation than she began in. In other, more predictable forms of media which depict female empowerment, women are able to assert themselves without consequence, are able to easily choose the correct path. In folk horror, there are always consequences, and the right thing to do is not clear. There are no superwomen in folk horror, no perfect people who always know how to act, just normal, fallible, and realistic human beings. Much like reality, the morals of a situation are not always clear. Danny's problem is that she is faced with two less than ideal options. The first is to stay in a toxic relationship with her boyfriend, and the second is to join a cult. The cult arguably shows her more compassion than anyone else in the film, and perhaps even really does care about Danny. In one of the climactic scenes of the film, the women of the village comfort Danny when she realizes that Christian has cheated on her. It's not clear whether this is part of the manipulation or, in fact, genuine, but it's arguably the most support she has received from anyone during the film. In the end, neither Danny nor the audience know whether she is in a better position than she was at the start of the film. For some, that's a frustrating ending, but ultimately closer to the reality which people face in their real lives. Will Danny find the support that she so desperately needs in the women of the village, or simply another toxic relationship? We will never know, but it does bring us to the next important theme in folk horror: sisterhood. Danny potentially finds support in other women where she never did find that support in her boyfriend. In folk horror, we often see women banding together for support and protection, and if there are genuine cases of female empowerment in folk horror stories, then it is found in these stories. Sisterhood. A common theme of folk horror is a matriarchal society, or a sisterhood who is powerful within a community. The novel Harvest Home by Thomas Tryon is a good example. Harvest Home is set in the remote rural town of Cornwall Coombe. The town is essentially run by a matriarchal figure called the Widow Fortune. While she is not directly in charge of the town, she pulls all the strings from behind closed doors. Within the town, there is a secret cult exclusively made up of women, which carries out ritual sacrifices. No men are allowed to see or know anything about the cult. If they do, then they are maimed to prevent them from talking to others about it. One character has his tongue cut out and his mouth sewn up because he discovers the truth. In the story, we follow a married couple and their daughter who have just moved to the town of Cornwall Coombe. Nicholas, the main character in the story, and his wife Beth have a tumultuous relationship. Beth appears to have tried to leave Nicholas and take their daughter with her, but Nicholas has convinced her to stay in the relationship. Beth is clearly unsatisfied though. Nicholas has cheated on her several times, and Beth longs for more independence in her life. The closer Beth comes into contact with the Widow Fortune, the more she is accepted into the sisterhood of women in the village, and the happier she becomes. Eventually, later in the story, Nicholas once again cheats on Beth. This last betrayal is enough to send Beth fully into the arms of the cult. Through the actions of the cult, Nicholas is eventually blinded. He has his eyeballs removed. In the final scene of the film, we see that Beth's disposition is almost completely changed. She is happy and satisfied, no longer being under the control of Nicholas. The sisterhood has blinded Nicholas and thereby removed all his power over Beth. As I explained in my previous video on the history of folk horror, Harvest Home closely mirrors the story of Persephone, Demeter, and Hades from Greek mythology. Persephone is abducted by Hades and taken away from her mother, Demeter, and held captive in the underworld. Eventually, Persephone escapes and is reunited with Demeter. In Harvest Home, Beth's mother dies when Beth is young, therefore they are separated. Beth then lives with her domineering father, and then marries Nicholas in order to escape from her father, but inadvertently moves into another controlling situation. So Beth has been under the control of men her whole life. She's never had independence. Finally, when Beth meets the Widow Fortune, who is a matriarchal and mother figure, she is reunited with her symbolic mother, and the men who have power over Beth are vanquished, just like when Persephone escapes Hades and is reunited with her mother Demeter. Harvest Home, much like the story of Persephone, is, at its core, a story of female emancipation, of women finding independence and escaping from the control of men. It is through the conspiracy and sisterhood of women in the village that Beth is freed from Nicholas. While Harvest Home is a story of female emancipation, it is not necessarily the kind of story which should be held up as an example for women. The cult in Harvest Home is highly immoral and not only ritually sacrifice human beings, but also maim and torture innocent people who happen to discover too much about their secrets. It's undeniable that the cult is full of strong and independent women, but neither are they good people. Beth's reaction to Nicholas is spurred on by his behavior, both his insistence that she stays in their relationship and his adultery. Beth's behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is provoked. Ultimately, in Beth and Nicholas's relationship, no one is the good guy or the bad guy. Both have wronged their partner. Their relationship is characterized by a struggle for power. Ultimately, Harvest Home presents a grim reality. The only thing that can emancipate a person is power and violence. Harvest Home concerns the hidden struggle between men and women and presents a theme which commonly accompanies gender conflict in folk horror: male hubris. Nicholas's fatal flaw is his own hubris. He believes in his superiority. Despite the warning of other men in the village, he does not believe that the cult can or will hurt him. Male hubris is often a propelling force in folk horror stories and a source of conflict between genders. Male hubris. In Midsummer, The Witch, Antichrist, and Harvest Home, we see male characters who are ultimately destroyed by their own hubris. These male characters dismiss women's feelings and suggestions, are often overconfident in their own abilities, and lack caution. In the 2009 film Antichrist, Willem Dafoe's character is a therapist who tells his grieving and mentally ill wife to throw away her medication prescribed to her by a psychiatrist. He believes he can help her to work through her issues where others can't. The result is disaster. The therapist's motivation for wanting his wife to throw away her medication is somewhat murky. A therapist, without a medical degree, cannot prescribe medication. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who is specialized in mental health. Even though a psychiatrist may actually have less mental health training than a therapist, they have a greater range of options for treating a patient. You get the sense that Willem Dafoe's character, who is a therapist, has something to prove. He wants to show that even though he can't prescribe medication, he can be just as effective at treating a patient. The only issue is that he really doesn't have his wife's best interest at heart here. His actions are more about himself than what would be best for her. His hubris is his downfall in the film. In Midsummer, Christian ignores Danny's concerns about the Swedish village where they are guests.
Christian, this is feeling really wrong. We need to leave.
I know that this is weird, but it's because it's alien.
No.
We haven't been exposed to anything like
No,
this.
Christian, no, please. This is completely backwards.
We just need to
leave.
acclimate.
I don't want to acclimate. I want to go.
Well, I can't. I'm sorry. Period. I'm doing my thesis on this.
Christian wants to pursue his research of the village and its religion for his PhD in anthropology, even though it's dangerous and he really doesn't have the academic skills to pull it off. Christian immediately gets out of his depth and is manipulated by the cult. In the film The Witch, Thomason's family is exiled from their religious Puritan community because Thomason's father is too extreme in his religious belief. He unwisely decides to take his family into the wilderness to live independently. Thomason's father refuses to acknowledge that he doesn't have the skills to survive without his community and slowly his family pay the price for his stubbornness.
You asked me to speak truth.
I beg thee.
You cannot bring the crops to yield. You cannot hunt. Is that truth enough?
Enough.
Thou canst do nothing save cut wood.
Faith!
You will not hear me!
Many of these narratives are initiated by male hubris, men's unwillingness to accept their own limitations, or to accept that they are equal to women. Many of these stories end in disaster because the men refuse to listen to the advice of women around them. They are overconfident in their own abilities and perhaps inherently see themselves as more capable and intelligent than the women in their lives. While women's warnings or advice is often ignored by men in folk horror, this is often juxtaposed with women who have power or influence over men in a sexual context. Let's take a look at this aspect of women in folk horror. Seduction in folk horror. Romance is not the first word that comes to mind when a person thinks of folk horror. Although, if the word seduction came to mind when you consider folk horror, that honestly wouldn't surprise me. When you consider the act of seduction in folk horror films, it is genuinely surprising how often women seduce or attempt to seduce men in folk horror films. In The Wicker Man, the barmaid tries to seduce Sergeant Howie. In The Blood in Satan's Claw, Angel tries to seduce the priest. In The Witch, Midsummer, and Harvest Home, we see women who successfully seduce men. What is going on here? In many of the narratives involving seduction, the female seducers are depicted as threatening, scary actors, while the men are depicted as victims, although often willing participants who are being manipulated. That's not to say that the men are viewed sympathetically by the audience. They are depicted as willing participants, or even weak-willed and unable to resist the seduction of women. In The Witch, we see an unknown woman seduce Caleb, who is Thomason's younger brother, which eventually results in him being poisoned and dying. In Midsummer, after Christian is seduced, he is taken captive and loses all agency, which leads to his death. In Harvest Home, the seduction of Nicholas destroys his marriage and pushes his wife further into the cult, which eventually results in Nicholas being blinded. Generally speaking, if a man is seduced by a woman in folk horror, it is not a good thing. Interestingly, The Wicker Man doesn't fit this pattern. Sergeant Howie is an ideal sacrifice for the religious cult because he is a virgin. If he had given in to the seduction, then maybe he would have been spared, although then again maybe not. The villagers did intend to sacrifice him from the start. The seduction really seems to be about trying to pervert Howie's values, so it's still not a good thing. All of these examples of men being seduced by women are not romantic or positive occurrences. My hypothesis as to why women and seduction by women is depicted in such a way is that seduction is actually something that men fear. They fear losing control. They fear women being able to exert power over them. All of the folk horror films which I have just referenced have one very interesting thing in common. They are all written by men. And it's not as though these men all got together and decided to include this as a main theme in these works. This is clearly a theme that is a part of the lived experience of men, and the fact that it is included in horror films suggests that it is a source of fear for men. In Midsummer, we see that Christian initially struggles against the seduction, but is eventually convinced, and in truth it doesn't take much convincing to get him to cheat on his girlfriend. In The Wicker Man, Sergeant Howie is successful at resisting the seduction, but only barely. He is clearly struggling to remain faithful to his fiancée. It's interesting to note that these seductions are often depicted as being magical in some way or another, In The Wicker Man, there is definitely a sense that some supernatural force is acting on Sergeant Howie. It implies that Howie, or other men in these situations, are not entirely in control of themselves, or at least don't feel that they are. In Midsummer as well, charms and potions are used as part of Christian's seduction, so again there is a pseudo-magical component at play in that narrative. In the film The Witch, the seduction is outright supernatural, as we know that the vision which Caleb sees is not the witch's true appearance. What this says to me is that men are afraid of the power that women can exert over them, which to men seems to be present to an almost mystical or magical extent. This seductive power is perhaps most interestingly portrayed in The Witch. In The Witch, we see Thomasin unwittingly exert this power over her brother, Caleb. Caleb, whose only contact with a female even close to his own age is his older sister, seems, disturbingly, to be attracted to her. Thomasin seems to be completely unaware that her brother views her like this. She doesn't intend for her brother to notice her in this way. As disturbing as the situation is, it highlights an important point. Women, whether intentionally or unintentionally, can have this power over men. In the latest scene, we see the witch exert this power fully over Caleb. She completely seduces him and brings about his demise. Thomasin is unaware that she has this power, and just after she unwittingly catches her brother's attention, she does something very interesting. She pretends to be a witch in order to scare her younger siblings.
It was a witch, Mercy. You speak aright.
Thomasin!
It was I.
Liar.
'Twas I what stole him. I be the witch of the wood.
Liar. Liar.
I am.
Listen not to her, Mercy.
I am that very witch. When I sleep, my spirit slips away from my body and dances naked with the devil. That's how I signed his book.
No.
So she is unintentionally being seductive, and then afterwards she pretends to be a witch. Later in the film, the real witch does the exact same thing. She seduces Caleb and then reveals herself as a witch and poisons him. By the end of the film, Thomasin, who was at first just playing at being a witch, has now really become one. The recent events in her life have caused her to lose her innocence and girlhood. She has now become a woman, complete with the pseudo-magical power to seduce men. I think it's important to say that I don't think that this theme is misogynistic. Where seduction is concerned in folk horror, women are generally initiators, but the men are also willing participants. So far, when we look at folk horror, we have seen men struggling to control women and women struggling to control men. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, gender struggles are a common theme in folk horror. It's all about control. The film, Robin Redbreast, was part of the original wave of folk horror in the early 1970s, and contraception and gender relations are at the center of the film. In this film, we see Nora, a woman who moves from the city to a country town after a breakup with her long-term boyfriend. Life in a small town isn't what Nora expects, though. The only person who is even remotely nice to her is a local man named Robin. Gradually, we realize that Nora and Robin are being manipulated into a relationship by the town, and Nora eventually falls pregnant with Robin's child after Nora's housekeeper hides her contraception.
There's something I wanted to ask you about, Mrs. Viger. Something seems to be missing from the bathroom. I wondered if you'd moved it.
What's that, then?
A contraceptive cap, in fact. Never mind, it doesn't matter. I must have mislaid it somehow.
At the time, in the 1960s and 70s, Contraception and control of women's bodies was, of course, a pretty important topic, as it is now, and we even see the subject of abortion is brought up in the film.
But now I find I do mind. I do care. I do feel. I do want this child almost as much as I don't want it, maybe more. I'm mixed up and really rather unhappy about it. So don't tell me what to do, Rob. Because it may be your child, but it's certainly not your business.
The village wants Nora to have a child as part of the ritual they are conducting to improve the fertility of the region. Much the same way that women's bodies were the subject of scrutiny and control from society in the 1970s, Nora's body is being controlled, or at very least attempting to be controlled, by the village. The folk horror films I have been discussing all depict women struggling in one way or another against themselves or the world that constrains them. How they overcome or do not overcome their obstacles reflects the kind of moral ambiguity, power play, and Pyrrhic victory which occur so much in the real world. To say that folk horror presents role models for women, or for anyone really, wouldn't be entirely true. What folk horror does present are uncomfortable and challenging realities. While escapist films with characters who triumph above adversity are important, realistic depictions of real-life struggles are also equally as valuable. They offer us a chance to see that our struggles and failures are not so unusual at all. They are to be expected. Real life is not like a movie. It's riddled with opportunity costs and tough choices. Complete emancipation is often not a possibility, and even if you overcome your obstacles, you often still bear the scars of the struggle. I hope that you have enjoyed this exploration of women in folk horror, and I hope that you also share your thoughts in the comments below. I know that this will probably be a bit of a controversial subject, and I welcome any criticisms and suggestions, but please keep it civil. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good day.